African Continental Free Trade area is a dream that's been long in the making, from the perspective that African economic integration has been on the agenda of the African Union for a long time. But from a practical perspective, if you think about the actual implementation of the AfCFTA, it's only been about 5 years. So when you think about when the treaty was developed, started being taken on board by countries, being ratified, and being domesticated in various countries, that hasn't taken a long time, especially if we compare it, for instance, to the European experience, where it started with the Treaty of Rome and worked its way towards becoming the EU that we know today, and that took about a generation, 40 years or so, to really get to the levels of intra-European trade that we see. So I always tell people that we shouldn't be too hard on African integration, because in some ways we're leapfrogging the development path that's been taken by the EU, which I think it's the most kind of similar kind of economic arrangement. Now, if we look at what's been achieved so far, there's been a lot of momentum into getting countries to see the AfCFTA as an important guiding principle and also an economic imperative. Having said that, we see that intra-Africa trade hovers at around 18% of all African trade is within the continent, compared to an EU, which is at about 60%. So there's a long way to go to achieve this. And it's not just a trade barrier issue. So, countries could remove, or rather, it's not just a tariff issue. Countries could liberalize tariffs, but we know on the African continent, a lot also has to do with barriers that prevent connectivity in general. So if we think about infrastructure, moving things around, moving people around, even in terms of data connectivity, we still lag behind other continents. So if we look at the BCG trade model, we expect intra-African trade to grow by about 2% to 2030, but African trade, a continental market, is very powerful, because we see statistics that over the next 10 years or so, the African middle class will grow. We'll have the biggest middle class we've ever had, over 150 million people, but they're not in the same country. So to be able to think of them properly as a market, we have to resolve the e-commerce and the payments element of it to then make servicing this market a possibility. So I think those are the elements that I think an agenda to advance African economic integration should look at. And whilst doing so, ensuring that the trade that emerges is inclusive, because I think the backlash that we often see against trade is when they're winners but losers from the system. So also looking at those mechanisms that ensure that those regions that are not at the center of trade and are not the largest African economies also see a stake for themselves in opening up their markets. And so it should also be a sense of investment-led trade that allows a greater set of economic activity across the continent. On logistics, there's different layers to it. There's initiatives that are run by financial institutions, and I think principally I would call out Afreximbank and their drive towards a pan-African payment system. They've put some investment into that. Some work is being done to get more countries on board. I think obviously it's important to do it in a way that respects the financial integrity of every country and is in line with the central banking and payments rules. So I think that's what they're working through, getting more central banks interested in cooperating on this. But I think once that really is up and running, You also then have a layer to it in terms of the financial services that actually fund the trade that needs to happen. And I think financial service entities have a role to play there. Then there's the physical logistics part of it. Some of it requires core infrastructure, transport infrastructure, roads, etc. And I think there's an ecosystem of continental institutions that has come together, and our responsibility is to make sure that they scale. So, starting with the African Union, the infrastructure, energy, and digital commissioner and her department have a role to oversee a continental pipeline of credible cross-border projects. We've got entities like AfCFTA, AUDA, NEPAD, even the African Development Bank that come together to really help to advance those projects. But we know from the last statistics that only about 6% of projects that are in the AUDA NEPAD pipeline are actually in construction. So that's the point where I make us to say there's an ecosystem that's forming to help move cross-border infrastructure, but we need to get the pipeline moving faster than the rate at which it's moving. A lot of projects are mired in bureaucratic delay. If it's cross-border, there's often problems around different regulations, different standards. Some projects are overcoming that. We're seeing a lot of movement around Lobito corridor, for instance, where countries have come together to resolve some of the administrative and bureaucratic delays. And we're starting to see the infrastructure build happening. So it's going to take concerted effort to go to those continental priority projects and get funders and backers and really get them into construction. A lot of work on the infrastructure piece, coordinated by the African Union primarily, but working with a range of institutions to do that. There was what was the PIDA PEP 1 portfolio, then it became PIDA PEP 2 portfolio. There's also a set of projects, PIKI, that are championed by heads of state. And so what you mentioned, projects like, North-South Corridor, projects like Lobito, projects like the Lagos-Abidjan freeway, all of those are still in play and are still on the books with different rates of progress. Rates of progress that are much slower than, for instance, intracontinental projects in ASEAN or even in the EU. So there's got to be a concerted implementation-focused approach to moving this along. The youth question is very important because it's obviously potential, lots of potential in terms of the future labor force really growing fastest on the African continent than anywhere else. But you can also see in different parts of Africa where there is an economic opportunity, how that can also create a complex of young people leaving under dangerous circumstances, trying to go find opportunities outside the continent. You find also conflict arising where there's limited opportunity. So it is a double-edged sword. But if we look at some of the opportunities that are opened up by technology and the ability to trade services across borders, for instance, you see that there is possibilities for young Africans to be educated and skilled in a way that allows them to stay on the continent and be productive, or to offer services in the rest of the world, in some instances, without even having to leave.